Good morning, my dear students. Now, with part 3, David Copperfield. I hope all of you to bring your book and open your book, page number 19, El Manar, part 3. After David Copperfield asked Dora to marry him, and he was the happiest man on earth, and he returned home, he was shocked by finding his aunt Miss Betsy Fruitwood sitting on her luggage in his room and asked her to get her a chair, but she refused and told him that she wanted to sit on her luggage because they are the only things she has now, as everything else has gone. Then he went to ask Mr. Spenlow to return him the money, the £1,000 which his aunt gave him to find him work before, but Mr. Spenlow refused and told him that can't be done, Copperfield. He was walking home and he found that someone was walking beside him. It was Agnes. He was shocked because Agnes told him that Uriah Heep and his mother are now living with her and her father at Mr. Wakefield's house. But she didn't talk about her problem. She knew everything about his aunt's money and she came to help him. She offered him, or she suggested him work in the evening, and he agreed immediately and thanked her. Then he went to visit his friend Trodless, and he found his old friend Micawber at Trodless' house. Trodless told David that Uriah Heep invited Mr. Micawber to help him in Mr. Wakefield's house. And Mr. Micawber accepted the job, and he was going to live with Mr. Wakefield at his house in Canterbury. But David Copperfield was unhappy to hear that. Then when he arrived at his office one morning, he discovered that Mr. Spenlow had been killed in a coach accident. Mr. Spenlow was the father of Dora. Now David Copperfield was so sorry because his beloved father died. David Copperfield wanted to see Dora, but she was not at home. She was staying with some of her aunts in Putney. And he discovered later after that Mr. Spenlow had left her a very little money. He was so puzzled. How could he marry Dora without money? Now, Agnes is living with her father at her father's house, Mr. Wakefield, in London, and he wanted to visit her to ask her for advice. But he discovered that Agnes has lots of problems. Some of these problems are related to Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber now is working at Mr. Wakefield's house, but Mr. Micawber was all the time worried and silent. David Copperfield guessed that there is something wrong, but he doesn't know what is it. While they were having dinner at Mr. Wakefield's house in the evening, Uriah Heep lifted his glass and said to wonderful Agnes, "To be her father is a proud thing, but to be her husband..." I think you understand now that Uriah Heep wants to marry Agnes, although her father is refusing that. Mr. Wakefield gave a terrible cry. "No, I have given up my home, but I will never give up my daughter." Then Mr. Wakefield fell back in his chair and began to cry. Mr. Copperfield hated Uriah Heep more than before. After that, David Copperfield went to see his beloved girl, Dora. He told us that Dora is a very beautiful girl, but he was angry that he found her aunts are dealing with her, are talking with her as a child, not an adult. He wanted her to be an adult wife, to be a clever wife. He didn't like that. And he told Dora that he didn't like that. But she was angry. She told him that her aunts are very kind to her and she is very happy. And she began to cry. David Copperfield kissed away her tears and he didn't want to make her upset. She told him that she wanted to be a good housekeeper, but she can't. Also, David Copperfield wanted Dora to be a housekeeper, so he gave her several books about cooking, but she didn't read them. They made her headache. She put them in the corner and her dog Jab sat on them. She told him that I wanted to be a good wife, but I can't. She was afraid to meet Agnes, as Agnes was a clever girl, but at last she met Agnes and they became close friends. At that time, David Copperfield never worked as a lawyer and he began to write. He began to sell his books to publishers, and this helped him much to make a lot of money to marry Dora. Dora became his wife, and he loved her from all his heart. But she couldn't manage the house, although she had servants. But Dora was afraid of her servants. She didn't tell them to do their work. David Copperfield loved Dora from all his heart, so he didn't want to blame her. All the time she was worried and unhappy and she began to get tired and ill. It was clear that Dora is now dying. She asked David to see Agnes and she talked with Agnes quietly. David Copperfield was sure that Agnes would comfort his poor child wife, but unfortunately the same night Dora died and his world was dark and lonely. His heart was broken, his pretty Dora gone, and he received a letter from Mr. Micawber in Canterbury. Mr. Micawber wanted David Copperfield to visit him with his friend Trudless at Mr. Wickfield's house in Canterbury, and he did as Mr. Micawber asked, but he took his aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, with him. Uriah Heep was surprised and shocked to see Mr. Micawber with Trudless with Aunt Betsy Trotwood at Mr. Wickfield's house in Canterbury. Then Agnes came in. At the same moment, Mr. Micawber was with Mr. Wickfield at his office. Mr. Micawber came out of the office and pointed at Mr. Uriah Heep and told him, "Heep, you are a thief, you are a criminal." This is part 1. Thank you. Let's complete part 2 in another sounding.